My name is Miles Lockwood, and the day my father was buried was the day I buried more than a man. I buried an entire chapter of my life that I thought would last forever. The chapter where I was someone's son. The chapter where my illusions of family and loyalty still felt like they might mean something. My father was my anchor, my mentor, and the founder of Lockwood and Stein, a $35 million logistics empire that rose from dirt roads, late nights, and that unshakable Midwestern work ethic that lived in his bones. I stood by his casket, my hands numb at my sides, the scent of lilies mixing with the dry, brittle air of the funeral home. The men from the board of directors filed past, each one shaking my hand with the same practiced sympathy, each one calculating how this loss might benefit or harm their own positions. I watched my mother's eyes, hollow but dry, her fingers picking at the hem of her black silk sleeve. And then I turned to Celeste, my wife of 5 years. She looked perfect, as always, her lips painted the exact shade of rose that matched the funeral's floral arrangements. Her hair pulled back so tightly it looked like it might snap. She didn't cry. She didn't look at me. She just stared at the casket like it was a prop in someone else's story. And beside her, her mother Francine, draped in pearls, and that smug, sour smile that always made my stomach clench. The queen of passive contempt. I swear she looked at me like I'd inconvenienced her by grieving. The eulogy felt like it lasted hours. My father's pastor spoke about legacy and vision and the bedrock of the community, but my head was a fog, my thoughts an echo chamber of regrets and unfinished conversations. I remembered the last words Dad said to me. Something about making sure I took care of the company, that I didn't let anyone take what was ours. He'd worked too hard, he'd said, to let it be swallowed by sharks. I promised him I'd watch it like a hawk. I didn't know then that the biggest sharks were already in my house. After the service, we filed out in that dazed, funeral shuffle, handshakes, muttered condolences, eyes that didn't meet mine. Celeste looped her arm through mine like we were attending a garden party. "You did great," she whispered, her tone like she was congratulating me on a performance. I didn't know what to say. She looked around the cemetery as if assessing its landscaping budget. Francine was already on her phone, probably texting her nail technician. My father's lawyer, an older man named Raymond Burke, met me by the Blacktown car. He was somber but direct. "When you're ready, I need to go over the estate folder with you. It's straightforward, but your father wanted it done right." I nodded. "When?" I asked. "Tomorrow," he said, then gave me a look that said, "I wish it didn't have to be so soon, but that's how these things go." That night, the house felt like a museum. Every shadow looked like him, every smell a memory. I sat at his desk, my desk now, and stared at the stack of condolences cards that had arrived in the mail. My mother had retreated to her room with a bottle of Chardonnay and the door locked tight. Celeste flitted between rooms, humming to herself, checking her makeup, calling her friends to update them on the service. She never once asked if I was okay. Never once put a hand on my shoulder and said, "I'm here for you." I guess that's when the illusions really started to crack. That's when I saw her smile slip when she thought I wasn't looking. When I saw the gleam of opportunity in her eyes that wasn't grief but ambition. The next day, I met with Raymond. I expected details. Assets, paperwork, maybe a few instructions about donations or taxes. But when he slid the estate folder across the table, something in his face warned me that this was no ordinary estate meeting. "Miles," he said gently, "your father left you everything. The company, the properties, the patents. After taxes, it's worth a little over $35 million. My breath hitched. I stared at the folder, my hands trembling. Everything. My father had trusted me with everything. A mix of gratitude and pressure hit me like a wave. I was proud and terrified. I took the folder home like it was the Holy Grail. I set it on the table in the living room and poured myself a whiskey, my father's drink of choice, neat, no ice. I thought maybe Celeste would be happy for me, or at least for us. But when she walked in, her eyes didn't land on me. They landed on the folder. She crossed the room in 2 strides, picked it up like it was her birthright, and began flipping through the pages. "So," she said, voice light but eyes sharp, "we should give half to Mom, right?" I blinked. "Excuse me." Her eyes didn't waver. "She raised me alone, Miles. She deserves it." The glass slipped from my fingers and shattered on the floor. I thought I'd misheard her. But she just kept looking at me with that calm, expectant smile that I'd once thought was loving. "She deserves it," she repeated. And in that moment, The illusion I'd been holding on to about family, about marriage, about loyalty shattered just like the whiskey glass at my feet. I realized that the worst pain wasn't my father's absence. It was the presence of the people who'd pretended to love me but were waiting for the moment I was weakest to strike. My name is Miles Lockwood, and on the day my father was buried, so was my illusion. The real grief hadn't even begun. I sat across from my father's attorney in the sterile conference room, the kind that smelled like old books and ink, a place that didn't seem big enough to hold the magnitude of what he was about to say. Raymond Burke, a man I'd known since I was 12, had always been steady, like the metronome my dad used to keep on his desk. I expected a review of minor details, a few signatures, a transfer of some assets, the usual legal loose ends. But when Raymond cleared his throat, his eyes heavy with something that felt like both sympathy and apology, my stomach twisted into a knot I couldn't untangle. He slid the thick folder across the table, his fingers lingering a moment on the leather cover, like he was reluctant to let it go. "Miles," he said slowly, his voice catching on my name the way it never had before, "your father left you everything." I blinked. "Everything?" I repeated, the word tasting foreign, heavy, like a stone in my mouth. Raymond nodded. "Properties. Patents. The company. After taxes? 35.2 million. The number rattled around in my head like loose change in a dryer. Everything. I'd always known Dad trusted me, but this? It was a burden I hadn't even realized was waiting for me, a responsibility that made my chest tighten. I felt proud, of course I did it. Proud that he'd believed in me, proud that he'd chosen me over the dozens of sharks who'd circled the company boardroom for years. But beneath that pride was a dull ache that told me this wasn't going to be easy. I thought about all the late nights I'd spent at his side, learning the business, the contracts, the numbers that made Lockwood and Stein what it was. I thought about the stories he'd told me. About the years when it was just him and a beat-up Ford truck, delivering crates by hand because he couldn't afford drivers. I thought about the sweat and the calluses on his hands and how he'd always said, "Someday, son, this will all be yours, but only if you earn it." And here it was. All of it. Mine. The gravity of that hit me hard. I signed where Raymond told me to sign, my pen trembling slightly as I scrawled my name over the lines that would forever tie me to my father's legacy. It was a moment I'd thought about my whole life, but now that it was here, it felt less like a victory and more like a test I didn't know how to pass. I gathered the folder, thanked Raymond, and left the office feeling like I'd stepped into a pair of shoes that were 3 sizes too big. When I got home, I placed the documents on the table like they were a holy relic. The sun had dipped behind the hills, leaving the house in a quiet glow that felt too serene, too deceptive. I poured myself a drink, just one, and sat on the couch, staring at the folder like it might open itself and tell me what to do next. The front door opened with that familiar click, and Celeste walked in, her heels tapping across the hardwood floor. She looked at the folder, her eyes zeroing in on it like a hawk. "What's all this?" she asked, her voice bright, too bright. I told her, slowly, carefully, the words catching in my throat. "My father left me everything. 35 million after taxes. The company, the properties, everything." I watched her face change, like a shadow passing across the sun. Her smile spread, slow and deliberate, like oil on water. She picked up the folder, flipped through the pages as if she already owned them. Her eyes gleamed in a way that made me feel like I was standing on a trapdoor. Then she said it, the words that would split my life in two. "So we should give half to Mom, right?" I blinked. "Excuse me." She didn't flinch. "She raised me alone, Miles. She deserves it." I tried to laugh, a dry, humorless sound that got caught in my throat. "She deserves it," I repeated, the words echoing back at me like an accusation. Celeste didn't even look up. "Yes, she sacrificed everything for me. It's only fair." I stared at her, unable to process the audacity, the sheer entitlement. This was my father's life's work, his sweat, his blood, his sleepless nights. And she wanted to hand half of it to a woman who'd never worked a day in her life, who'd never even shown up to his funeral on time. My father would have laughed at the suggestion if he hadn't been lying in the ground. "No," I said finally, the word sharp, definitive. Celeste's eyes narrowed, a glint of something dangerous lurking behind her carefully constructed facade. "Miles, she's family," she said, her tone cold now, calculating. "We give her half. It's only right." I felt my jaw tighten. "Family?" She didn't even bother to pay her respects. She left the funeral before the eulogy ended. She's not family, she's an opportunist. Celeste stood there, unmoving, like a statue carved from ice. That's just how she is, she said. Emotional stuff makes her uncomfortable. I shook my head, anger rising in my chest like a storm. No, Celeste. She just makes me uncomfortable. The silence between us stretched, thick and heavy, until it felt like the walls themselves were pressing in on me. That night, I slept in the guest room for the first time in 5 years. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, the echoes of my father's voice running circles in my mind. Protect what's yours, he'd said. Don't let anyone take what you built. I realized then that the real fight wasn't with the board of directors or the competitors or the market share. The real fight was at home, in my own bed, under my own roof. And I wasn't sure I was ready, but I knew I couldn't back down. Because if I did, I'd lose not just the money, not just the company, but the very thing my father had spent his life building. And I wouldn't let that happen. Not now. Not ever. I never thought a dinner table could feel like a battlefield, but that night, it did. The dining room had always been a place of laughter, of shared stories, of clinking glasses and the warm glow of candles. But as I sat across from Celeste, her eyes cold and unyielding, I felt like I was staring down an enemy I'd never known was there. She picked at her salad with a kind of mechanical precision, her fork scraping the edge of the plate like nails on a chalkboard. I cleared my throat, trying to steady the tremor in my voice. Celeste, I began, were you serious about giving half of the inheritance to your mother? She didn't even look up. Of course I was, she said, her tone as calm as if we were discussing the weather. She's family. Family. The word tasted bitter in my mouth. Celeste, I said, trying to keep my voice level. This isn't a lottery ticket we just stumbled across. This is my father's life's work. He spent decades building Lockwood and Stein from nothing. Dirt roads, sweat, and nights I remember him coming home with his hands raw from loading crates himself. He built that empire for us, our family. She set her fork down, finally meeting my gaze. Exactly, she said, her eyes hard. Family. My mother sacrificed everything to raise me. You think we got here alone? She deserves to benefit from it, too. I felt something in me snap. Your mother didn't even bother to show up on time for my father's funeral, I shot back. She waltzed in halfway through the service, left before the eulogy even ended. She didn't cry. She didn't even pretend to care. Celeste's jaw tightened. That's just how she is. Emotional stuff makes her uncomfortable. I shook my head, my fingers tightening around my glass. No, I said. She just makes me uncomfortable. Celeste's face darkened, her lips pressing into a thin line. So what? She said finally, her voice low. You're just going to keep it all for yourself? You think that's what your father would have wanted? I leaned back, my chest tightening. I think he wanted me to protect his legacy, I said. I think he wanted me to honor the work he put into building something from nothing, something honest and real. And I don't think he'd want me to give half of it away to someone who sees it as a golden ticket. She crossed her arms, her eyes like shards of glass. You're selfish, she spat. You're letting money change you. I laughed then, a cold, humorless sound that made her flinch. Money didn't change me, I said. It revealed you. The words hung in the air like smoke. For a moment, I thought I saw something in her eyes, a flicker of regret, maybe, or shame. But then it was gone, replaced by that same cold determination. Well, she said, her voice icy. If that's how you feel, maybe we should sleep in separate rooms tonight. I didn't even hesitate. Maybe we should, I said, standing. I walked out of the dining room, the sound of my footsteps on the hardwood floor louder than any argument we'd had. I lay in the guest room that night, staring at the ceiling, the shadows playing tricks on me. I thought about my father, how he'd always sat at the head of the table, his presence filling the room with something solid, something safe. I thought about the way he looked at me when I was 12 and told him I wanted to join the business one day. He'd smiled and ruffled my hair. You'll have to earn it, he'd said. Every inch. I wondered what he'd say now, seeing his son at war with his own wife over the legacy he'd left behind. I wondered if he'd be proud of me for standing my ground, or if he'd be disappointed that it had come to this. The house was too quiet, the silence heavy and oppressive. I could hear Celeste in the other room, her footsteps pacing, her voice low as she spoke on the phone, probably to her mother. I imagined the two of them plotting, planning how to carve up what wasn't theirs. I felt anger, hot and sharp, but beneath it was something colder, a sense of betrayal that cut deeper than any blade. This was supposed to be the woman who stood by my side, the woman who shared my dreams, my burdens, my triumphs. But now I saw her for what she was, an opportunist wearing the mask of a wife. I thought about calling Raymond, but it felt too soon, too final. I needed to be sure. I needed to be ready. So I waited. I watched. I listened. And I planned. Because this wasn't just about money. It was about loyalty. It was about respect. It was about the promise I'd made to my father to protect what he'd built, to honor the life he'd given me. And I would, no matter what it cost me. The days that followed felt like I was living in someone else's house. Francine began showing up unannounced, her presence a constant reminder of the fracture splitting my life in two. It started small. A knock on the door in the middle of the morning, Celeste greeting her mother like royalty while I was still bleary-eyed from a sleepless night. I'd come downstairs and find them huddled at the kitchen table, coffee cups in hand, their voices dropping to whispers the moment I entered the room. "Oh, Miles," Francine would say with that saccharine smile. I was just helping Celeste with some ideas for the house. Her tone dripped with false concern, every word polished to a shine that made my skin crawl. She started bringing brochures for oceanfront condos, every one more expensive than the last. Tasteful, she'd say, tapping a manicured nail against the glossy pages. Nothing extravagant, of course. As if the inheritance my father left me was a bottomless well. I'd grit my teeth, forcing a polite nod, all the while feeling like I was being caged in my own home. Another day, I came home from a late meeting to find Francine measuring our living room. She had a tape measure in hand, her lips pursed in concentration as she jotted down notes in a small leather-bound planner. "For the custom sofa," she said, barely glancing at me. "You'll want something that says success, but not too flashy." The bile rose in my throat, but before I could reply, Celeste appeared at my side, her arm looping through mine like a noose. "She's just trying to help," she whispered, her voice dripping with exasperated affection. "Don't be dramatic." Dramatic. That word rattled in my head like a loose screw. Dramatic was the way Francine arrived every day like she owned the place. Dramatic was the way Celeste's eyes sparkled when her mother started talking about renovations and new kitchens and marble countertops. Dramatic was how I felt every time I watched my wife's loyalty shift like sand in the wind. One morning, I'd had enough. I changed the locks on my home office. That room had always been my sanctuary, the place where my father taught me how to read balance sheets, where I'd sat at his desk after school as he explained the logistics business to me like it was a living, breathing thing. Francine had no right to be in there, rummaging through my father's files like a raccoon. I moved a portion of the inheritance into a protected trust. Something Dad's lawyer, Raymond, had set up years ago but left dormant until now. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about drawing a line. It was about showing them, showing her, that I wasn't the fool they'd taken me for. That afternoon, I called Raymond. His voice was calm, reassuring, the same way it had always been. "Raymond," I said, trying to keep my voice from cracking, "I need advice." He didn't hesitate. "Install cameras," he said. "Document everything. Especially with your wife's family involved." The words tasted like ash, bitter and humiliating. Spying in my own home. On my own wife? But even as I recoiled, I knew he was right. I bought small, discreet cameras and placed them in the office, the hallway, the living room, anywhere Francine might feel emboldened to snoop. The first few days, I checked the footage and found nothing but mundane conversations and the hum of an ordinary house. I almost started to believe I'd overreacted. But on the third day, the footage confirmed everything I'd feared. Francine, dressed in a white blouse and pearls, was in my office. She had the calm, determined expression of a woman who thought she was untouchable. I watched her pull open drawers, flip through files, her eyes darting to the door every few seconds. My stomach clenched when she reached for the folder that held the trust documents. She traced her fingers over the cover like it was her own. The audacity, the sheer gall, made my blood boil. That night, I confronted her. She was in the kitchen, pouring herself a glass of wine from my father's old decanter, a piece I'd kept. Because it reminded me of the nights he'd let me have a sip, telling me it was our secret. Seeing her with it felt like a violation. "Looking for a notepad, were you?" I asked, my voice low but steady. She turned, eyes wide, the practiced innocence already sliding into place. "Oh, Miles," she said, her hand fluttering to her chest. "I was just, save it." I snapped, the anger burning through me. "You had no right to be in my office. No right to touch my father's things." She blinked, her lips parting in a perfect "oh." "I was only curious," she said, her tone a mixture of condescension and faint concern. "Curious." I repeated, the word catching in my throat like a splinter. "No. You were casing the vault." She flinched, just for a second, but then she straightened, the mask sliding back into place. "I think you're overreacting," she said, her voice ice-cold now. "I was only trying to help." Help? The word made me laugh, a bitter, broken sound. That night, I told Celeste. I laid it all out, the footage, the files, the trust, every violation. She sat there, her face blank, her lips pressed together so tightly they were white. And then, with a sigh that sounded like she was scolding a child, she said, "She's just curious, Miles. Curious." The word stuck in my mind like a thorn. And in that moment, I knew. This wasn't just about Francine anymore. It was about Celeste, too. Because she wasn't just standing by while her mother picked the bones clean. She was holding the leash, guiding the hands that tried to take everything my father had worked for. And I decided then and there, I would fight back. With every tool my father had given me. With every ounce of strength I had left. Raymond's voice on the phone was the last thing I wanted to hear, but the first thing I needed. "Install cameras," he'd said, and I'd done it. Every step feeling like a betrayal, but knowing deep down it was the only way to protect myself from the rot creeping through my own home. When I told him about the footage, Francine's hands in my father's files, her eyes hungry, he sighed like a man who'd seen too much. "Document everything," he said, "especially if your wife's family is involved." His tone carried the weight of 1,000 cautions I should have heard earlier. I thought I could handle Celeste. I thought our 5 years of marriage meant something. But the moment those cameras blinked to life and recorded her mother rummaging through my desk like a scavenger, I knew there was no more room for illusions. I felt dirty, like I was spying on my own life. The footage was damning. Francine in her pearls, her lips pursed in that perpetual expression of judgment, her hands opening drawers and rifling through folders. She'd pause at each label, reading, considering. She found the trust documents, flipped them open like she was skimming a magazine, and I swear she smiled. My gut twisted as I watched her fingers hover over my father's signature. She was casing the vault, just like I'd feared. And Celeste? She was always in the background, always one step behind, pretending ignorance, her smile stretched too tight. That night, I confronted Francine in the living room. She was seated on my father's favorite armchair, like she owned the place, a glass of Chardonnay in hand. "What were you looking for in my office?" I demanded, my voice steady but shaking inside. She didn't even blink. "Oh, Miles," she crooned, the way a vulture might sweet-talk its prey. "I was just looking for a notepad." I laughed, sharp and humorless. "A notepad?" My eyes bored into hers, refusing to let her look away. "You were in there for 30 minutes, Francine. What were you really looking for?" She gave me that tight, practiced smile. "You're being dramatic," she said. "I was only curious." Curious. That word again, like acid on my tongue. The same word Celeste had used. Curious was a hand in the cookie jar. Curious was a dagger between the ribs. I walked away, but the heat of her gaze followed me, the weight of her entitlement pressing on my chest like a stone. I found Celeste in the kitchen, stirring a pot of sauce like nothing had happened. "Your mother was in my office," I said, voice low, too tired to raise it. She didn't look up. "She's just curious," she repeated, the same script, the same rehearsed lie. My hands trembled. "Curious," I echoed. She was going through my father's trust documents. She had no right. Celeste finally turned, her eyes cold and flat. "Miles, she's family," she said, the words a verdict. "Family." I spat, my anger breaking through. "Family respects boundaries. Family doesn't treat my father's legacy like a shopping mall. Family doesn't take what doesn't belong to them." She crossed her arms, defensive, her lips twisting. "You're overreacting," she said. "It's not like she's stealing from you." My laugh came out like a bark. "She's testing the waters," I said. "She's waiting for me to break. And you're helping her." Her eyes flickered, but she didn't deny it. She didn't even blink. "Maybe," she said finally. "But maybe you should be asking yourself why you're so afraid of sharing." Sharing. Like this was a potluck. Like my father's empire was a casserole dish we could all dip our spoons into. The rage rose in my throat, hot and bitter. but I swallowed it. I turned away, walked down the hall, and closed my office door. I locked it this time, the key cold and solid in my palm. I called Raymond. I need to record everything, I told him. Every conversation, every threat, every lie. He didn't hesitate. I'll have a flash drive delivered to you tomorrow, he said. And Miles, don't let them know what you're doing. I hung up and stared at the locked door. The cameras blinked at me, silent sentinels in a war I hadn't chosen. Every word, every glance, every sigh, captured. And I hated it. I hated that this was what my life had become. But I hated more that Celeste and her mother had made it necessary. That night, Celeste came to the office door. She knocked softly, a smile in her voice. Miles, can we talk? I opened the door but didn't invite her in. She wore that same fake sweetness, the one that had once made me feel safe. Now it made my skin crawl. I was thinking, she said, her eyes bright. Maybe we should take a trip. Maldives, maybe. Somewhere to clear our heads. I stared at her, the betrayal of physical weight in my chest. A trip? I asked, my voice hollow. After everything that's happened? She gave a little laugh, like I was being silly. It's been a tough time, Miles. We both need a break. I watched her eyes, the way they didn't quite meet mine. I wondered if she knew I'd seen the footage. I wondered if she cared. No, I said finally. I'm not going anywhere. Her smile faltered. You're making this harder than it needs to be, she whispered. And that's when I knew. There was no fixing this. No salvaging what was left. She was too far gone. The next morning, I opened the flash drive from Raymond. I plugged it into my laptop, copied over every recording, every file. I made a backup, then another, and I waited. Because sooner or later, they'd make their move. And this time, I'd be ready. The next few days felt like a masterclass in manipulation. Celeste became soft in a way I hadn't seen in months. She made lasagna, my favorite, even though I hadn't told her that since our first year of marriage. She folded my laundry. She left post-it notes on the bathroom mirror that said, I'm sorry, with a heart drawn beside it. At first, I almost believed it. The way she carried herself, the way her voice dropped when she asked, can we just move past this? It felt like the woman I'd married had returned. But then I saw the cracked lid of my laptop one morning, the small fracture that hadn't been there the night before. My stomach dropped. I checked the login attempts. 2 failed attempts. The webcam had activated itself overnight. My breath caught in my chest. I knew the cameras were working. I checked the footage and saw her standing there in the glow of the screen, her hair pulled back, her fingers trembling as she typed and retyped the password I'd changed only days before. The desperation in her eyes, the way she chewed her bottom lip, it was all there in grainy black and white. I sat back, watching her betrayal unfold like a slow-motion train wreck. Every tap of her finger on the keyboard felt like a knife. When I confronted her, she didn't even flinch. Must have been a glitch, she said, her smile dripping with feigned innocence. She put her hand on my shoulder like it was supposed to soothe me. Maybe you forgot to shut it down. I felt my anger boiling, but I forced a smile of my own. Sure, I said. A glitch. But I knew better. I knew the truth was clawing its way out from underneath the lies, and there was no putting it back. I started recording audio, too. Every conversation, every sigh, every half-lie that crossed her lips. I couldn't trust anything anymore. The cameras were my eyes. The recorder was my memory. I sent the files to Raymond in batches, every new piece of evidence a nail in the coffin of our marriage. He didn't say much, but the way he cleared his throat every time he opened a file told me he understood the gravity. One night, Celeste came into my office carrying a plate of brownies. She'd never baked a day in her life, and the smell of chocolate felt like a bride. I thought we could start over, she said, her voice honeyed. I took the plate, set it on the desk, and stared at her. Start over, I repeated. After everything that's happened? She blinked, the smile faltering. Miles, she pleaded, her eyes shining with unshed tears. I know things have been hard, but I'm your wife. I love you. I just want us to be okay again. My chest tightened. Part of me wanted to believe her. Part of me wanted to rewind to the days when she'd been my partner, not my adversary. But the footage didn't lie. The files didn't lie. The way she tried to reset the passwords, the way she tried to worm her way into the trust fund, none of it was love. It was desperation. And greed. I shook my head slowly. I think it's too late for that, I said, my voice low. She reached for my hand, but I pulled away. Her tears fell then, big and silent, dripping down her cheeks like something rehearsed. "I never meant to hurt you," she whispered. I wanted to scream that she had, that she'd buried the knife so deep I'd never fully pull it out. But I just sat there, watching her performance, the camera blinking quietly from the bookshelf behind me. After she left, I checked the footage. Every word, every tear, every desperate smile was there. I saved it to the flash drive and locked it in the safe. The next morning, Raymond called. "I've got the paperwork ready," he said. His voice was calm, but I could hear the weight in it. "You're sure you're ready for this?" I stared at the trust documents on my desk, the ones that bore my father's signature, the ones Francine had tried so hard to get her hands on. "I'm ready," I said. "It's time to protect what's mine." That afternoon, I sat in the office, the sun streaming through the blinds, catching dust motes in its light. I thought about my father, about the nights we'd spent going over logistics plans, the way he'd taught me to run a business with integrity. I thought about the promise I'd made him when he was dying, to protect the company, to honor his legacy. And I knew this was how I'd keep that promise. I'd loved Celeste once, loved her enough to believe the lies, to overlook the cracks. But love couldn't survive in a house built on betrayal. When she walked in that evening, her hair perfectly curled, her lips painted that same red she'd worn at the funeral, I felt a wave of anger mixed with grief. "I made reservations," she said, holding up her phone like a prize. "That new place on Fifth. I thought we could." I stood up, cutting her off. "I'm not going to dinner," I said. "We need to talk." Her smile faltered, the phone lowering slowly. "Miles," she began, but I shook my head. "No more lies," I said. "I know what you've been doing. I know about the passwords, the files. The cameras don't lie, Celeste. Neither does the recorder." Her eyes widened, her face pale. You recorded me?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "You gave me no choice," I said. "I'm done being played." She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Just a small, broken sound. I picked up the flash drive from the desk and held it between us. "I'm giving this to Raymond tomorrow," I said. "And then I'm filing for divorce." The tears came then, fast and thick, but they didn't move me. I'd seen the footage. I'd heard the lies. And I'd felt the betrayal. "Miles," she sobbed, reaching for me, but I stepped back. "It's over," I said, my voice a whisper of finality. And for the first time in months, I felt free. I woke up the next morning with a tightness in my chest that felt like the last remnants of a bad dream. The house was silent, the kind of silence that pressed down on you until your own breath sounded too loud. I swung my legs over the edge of the bed and listened. No soft footsteps in the hallway, no clink of coffee cups in the kitchen, just the weight of everything that had happened hanging in the air like a fog. When I finally made it downstairs, I stopped cold at the sight that greeted me. Francine, in her pink silk robe, one of those designer brands she always bragged about, was sitting at my kitchen table, her bare feet propped on the chair, sipping from my father's old coffee mug. That mug was sacred. He'd taken it everywhere, even to board meetings, claiming it brought him luck. Now her lipstick-stained lips pressed against its rim like a desecration. She looked up at me, calm and unbothered. "We need to talk," she said, her tone so casual it made my skin crawl. "About what, Francine?" I asked, my voice low but steady. She took another sip and set the mug down, the ceramic clink echoing through the kitchen like a gunshot. "You're not thinking clearly," she began, leaning back in the chair like she owned the place. "You're grieving, and you're letting that cloud your judgment. I just want to help you make the right decisions, before you burn through your father's legacy." My father's legacy. The words hit me like a slap. "My father's legacy is none of your concern," I said, my jaw tightening. Her eyes narrowed, the pleasant mask slipping just enough to reveal the predator beneath. "Oh, but it is," she said, her voice like syrup over poison. "Celeste and I, this is our future, too. You're being selfish, Miles. Keeping everything for yourself. It's not what your father would have wanted." I felt the rage building in my chest, but I kept my face calm. I'd learned that from Dad. Never let them see you bleed. "Get out," I said, my voice cold and sharp. She blinked, like she couldn't believe I'd spoken to her that way. "Excuse me," she spat. I took a step closer, the heat of my anger boiling over. I said, "Get out. Now." She stood, her robe swishing around her legs like a viper's tail. "You'd better be careful, Miles," she hissed. "Men like you break too." The threat hung between us like a storm cloud, but I didn't flinch. "Try me," I said, my voice steady. She glared at me for a long moment. and then she grabbed her purse from the table and stormed out, her heels clicking against the tile like gunshots. I locked the door behind her, the deadbolt sliding into place with a satisfying finality. My hands were shaking, but I felt a rush of relief. It was like I'd finally exhaled after holding my breath for months. I went back to my office and picked up the phone. Raymond answered on the second ring, his voice a lifeline in the chaos. "Raymond," I said, my voice trembling but strong. "It's time. File it." He didn't ask questions. He just said, "Understood," and hung up. I set the phone down and leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. The old plaster cracked in places, reminders of a house that had seen too many storms. I thought about the man who'd built that house, brick by brick, and the way he'd taught me to fight for what was mine. I thought about the promises I'd made to protect his legacy, to honor his name. And I knew I was doing exactly that. The house felt different now, like the weight had lifted. But I knew the fight wasn't over. Celeste would be back. She'd come armed with tears and apologies, and maybe even threats. But I was ready. I had the recordings, the documents, the proof. I had the truth. And I had Raymond. That night, I sat at my father's old desk, the wood worn smooth by decades of work. I ran my fingers over the grain, remembering the nights I'd fallen asleep there doing homework while he reviewed contracts. I thought about the way he'd always look up and smile when he saw me, like I was the best part of his day. I thought about how disappointed he'd be if he saw me letting Francine and Celeste pick apart his life's work like vultures. I wouldn't let that happen. Not now. Not ever. I opened the safe and pulled out the flash drive, the weight of it in my hand a reminder of everything I'd lost and everything I'd gained. The recordings, the footage, the trust documents, they were all there. Proof that I hadn't imagined it, that I wasn't crazy, that they really had tried to take what wasn't theirs. I tucked it into my pocket and closed the safe, the lock clicking shut like the end of a chapter. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the yard Dad had mowed every Sunday morning without fail. The grass was longer now, unkempt, but I didn't mind. It felt like a small rebellion against the chaos. I knew I'd have to rebuild. I'd have to mend the fences that Francine and Celeste had torn down. But I also knew that I wasn't alone. Dad's voice was still in my head, his lessons etched into my bones. I'd learned from the best, and now it was my turn to carry the torch. When I turned from the window, the house didn't feel like a battlefield anymore. It felt like mine, just mine, and that was enough to make me smile, even through the pain. I chose Marlin's Cafe because it was neutral ground, public enough that she couldn't create a scene, familiar enough that I could look her in the eye and not feel the walls closing in. I'd booked the corner table, the one by the window where the sun poured in around 2 o'clock, painting the scratched wooden table with light that felt too warm for what I was about to do. I got there early, ordered a black coffee, and watched the door. My foot tapped against the floor with an urgency that felt foreign, like I couldn't get the weight of what I was about to do off my chest fast enough. Celeste arrived 15 minutes late, which was typical. She always liked to make an entrance, and the day was no different. Her red lipstick was perfectly applied, the same shade she'd worn the night of the funeral, and her dress was fitted like she was going to a party instead of a divorce meeting. She carried herself like nothing was wrong, like she'd come to settle a minor dispute over brunch. She slid into the chair across from me, her eyes cool, assessing. "What's this all about, Miles?" She asked, voice light but wary, like she knew something was coming but thought she could talk her way out of it. I didn't say a word. I reached into my bag and pulled out the divorce papers, thick and neatly stacked, every page screaming of finality. I placed them between us, the weight of them a solid barrier. "What's this?" she asked again, her tone sharper now. "Divorce," I said, my voice steady. "And a flash drive your lawyer's going to love." Her eyebrows shot up, her lips parting in a half laugh. "You're ending our marriage over money," she scoffed, leaning back in her chair like she had the upper hand. "No," I said, leaning forward, my eyes locking on hers. "I'm ending it because I buried a father, and you tried to bury me under your mother's debt. Good luck explaining that in court." Her mouth opened, the color draining from her face as the weight of my words sank in. She tried to recover, straightening her posture, her hands clasping tightly in her lap. "Miles, don't be dramatic," she said, the mask slipping back into place. "This is a misunderstanding. We can work through this." I shook my head, a humorless laugh escaping my lips. "A misunderstanding? Is that what you call breaking into my office? Is that what you call resetting my passwords, rummaging through my father's legacy like it's a yard sale? Is that what you call? I stopped, my voice catching. No, Celeste. This isn't a misunderstanding. It's betrayal. She stared at me, her eyes hard, her lips trembling. You think you're so righteous, she spat. You think you're better than me. I leaned back, my coffee forgotten. No, I said. I just think I'm done with you. Her hands balled into fists, her nails digging into her palms. You can't do this, she hissed, her voice low, her eyes darting around the cafe as if she'd just realized we weren't alone. Watch me, I said. I pushed the flash drive toward her, the small silver rectangle a symbol of everything I'd recorded, every lie, every betrayal, every whispered conversation that proved what she'd tried to do. Give that to your lawyer, I said. Let him see exactly what you've been up to. She snatched it off the table, her hands shaking. You think this is over? She said, her voice breaking. You think you can just walk away and everything will be fine? I met her gaze, unwavering. No, I said. I know it's not fine, but I also know I'm free. She looked at me like she didn't recognize me, like the man who'd walked her down the aisle had disappeared and been replaced by someone she couldn't control. You'll regret this, she whispered. I shook my head. No, I said, my voice calm, steady. I'll regret that it took me this long. She sat there, frozen, her eyes glassy, her lips trembling like she wanted to scream but couldn't. I stood up, every muscle in my body tense, but lighter than they'd felt in months. I picked up the papers, placed them in front of her, and pointed at the signature line. You can sign them now, I said, or I can file them tomorrow and let the lawyers do it. Either way, this is happening. She stared at the papers like they were a death sentence, her breath ragged. I turned and walked toward the door, the sunlight hitting my face like a benediction. I didn't look back. Outside, the air was warm, the city noise muffled by the rush of blood in my ears. I walked to my car, the keys cool in my hand, the leather seat familiar under me. I took a deep breath and exhaled, the weight lifting with every second that passed. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw my reflection, tired but resolute. I started the engine and pulled away from the cafe, leaving behind the woman who'd tried to break me, the woman who'd underestimated what I'd learned from my father. This wasn't about money. It was about freedom, about self-respect, about the promise I'd made to myself when I stood at my father's casket, that I wouldn't let anyone destroy what he'd built or what he'd given me. As I drove home, the road stretched ahead, bright and empty, a promise waiting to be written. The week after I served Celeste, the divorce papers felt like a hurricane had torn through my life, leaving behind a quiet that felt wrong, too still, too expectant. I'd expected rage, tears, phone calls in the dead of night. Instead, she vanished like smoke in the wind, leaving only the faintest scent of her perfume on the sheets. But Francine, she was a different story. If Celeste was a snake, Francine was the queen cobra. She didn't even wait for the ink on the divorce papers to dry before making her next move. On Monday morning, I walked into the office of Lockwood and Stein, the place my father had built with his own calloused hands. The walls still smelled like his cologne, the familiar mix of cedarwood and old books. I ran my hand over the desk he'd left me, that would worn smooth by years of his fingers drumming out rhythms of thought and strategy. I felt him there, his spirit, his will, his determination that no one would ever take from us what he'd earned. That morning, the trust papers were waiting on my desk, along with a letter from Raymond. The trust, he reminded me, was airtight. Francine had no legal standing. She wasn't listed as a beneficiary. She had no claim to the company, the properties, or the patents. Even Celeste, despite her name on the marriage certificate, had no direct claim to Lockwood and Stein. She'd get her court-mandated share of marital assets, some jewelry, maybe a car, but the company was mine. I felt a calm pride wash over me as I read through the paperwork, every signature a testament to my father's foresight. He'd known there would be vultures. He'd known that grief made men vulnerable. He'd known that trust needed to be earned, not demanded. And I'd earned it. But even as I felt that pride, a bitter laugh bubbled at my throat. Because Francine hadn't given up. A private investigator I'd hired, a no-nonsense guy named Theo with a camera that never missed a trick, had uncovered the latest scheme. Francine had tried to apply for a business loan using my inheritance as collateral. My inheritance, the one my father had left me to protect this company from exactly this kind of predator. She'd taken my name, the company's name, and forged a plan to leverage it all to build herself an empire she didn't deserve. The bank had frozen her account as soon as Theo sent them the documents. They'd flagged the loan application as fraudulent, but I hadn't stopped her. I wanted to see just how far she'd go. And she went far. She'd even put her own house on the line. Proof that she was desperate, that she'd risk everything for a piece of what my father had built. But I didn't intervene. I didn't call. I didn't rage. I just watched as she tried to climb a ladder she had no business setting foot on. That's what she didn't understand about me. I didn't need to destroy her. She was already destroying herself. I called Raymond that afternoon. "We need to finalize the will," I said, my voice firm. "I want it done by the end of the week." He agreed, his voice calm, his tone one of steady support. "I understand, Miles. Your father would be proud of how you've handled this." I felt a rush of warmth at that, a reminder that I wasn't alone in this fight. The next day, I sat in the conference room with Raymond and the notary, a stack of papers in front of me that would determine the fate of everything my father had built. I read every line carefully, the words blurring sometimes as memories of my father's laughter, his rough hands, his unwavering confidence in me surfaced and faded. "I want to make some changes," I said finally, looking up at Raymond. He raised an eyebrow, but nodded. "Go ahead. I'm leaving a portion of my shares to Taryn," I said. "She's my goddaughter. Dad always said she had a good head on her shoulders." Raymond smiled slightly. "A wise choice." "And Clive," I continued, the image of my father's lifelong assistant vivid in my mind. "He's been with the company since before I could walk. He deserves to know he's part of this legacy." Raymond's smile widened. "Your father would approve." "Francine gets nothing," I said, my voice cold and certain. "She's already tried to steal what wasn't hers. I'm not giving her another chance." Raymond nodded, his pen scratching against the paper. "It's done." As I signed the final documents, I felt the weight lift off my shoulders, like a boulder rolling down a hill and leaving only dirt and sun in its wake. The pen felt heavy in my hand, but every stroke was a declaration. I will protect this. I will honor my father's name. I will make sure the people who deserve to be remembered are the ones who are. When it was done, I leaned back in the chair and let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. "Thank you," I said to Raymond. He shook his head. "No, Miles. Thank you. Men like your father don't come around often, and it's good to see that he left his legacy in hands that understand its worth." I left the office that afternoon and stepped into the sunlight, feeling the warmth on my face like a benediction. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. The battle wasn't over, not completely, but I'd drawn the lines. I declared where I stood, and I knew my father would have been proud. That night, I poured myself a glass of his favorite scotch and sat on the back porch, the stars winking in the sky like small promises. I thought about the trust he'd placed in me, the lessons he'd taught me about loyalty and grit. I thought about the way he'd always said, "A man's worth is in how he protects what matters." I took a sip of the scotch, the burn a reminder that life wasn't meant to be easy, but it was meant to be lived with honor. I didn't hate Francine. I didn't even hate Celeste, not anymore. Hate was too heavy, too consuming. What I felt was something quieter, something steadier. A resolve, a determination. I'd given them their chance to be part of the family my father had built, but they'd chosen greed over loyalty. And that was their burden to carry, not mine. I turned my gaze to the horizon, the sky bruised purple and gold, and made a silent promise to my father. "I will protect what you built. I will honor your name. I will make sure that no one, not Francine, not Celeste, not any of the vultures who circle in the night, will ever take from us what we earned with sweat and sacrifice." And in that promise, I found peace. The divorce was finalized a month later, the ink barely dry before the reality of it all hit me. I watched the last of Celeste's boxes get loaded into the back of a moving van, each one labeled in her tidy script. Like she'd organized the end of our marriage with the same care she'd once put into planning dinner parties. She didn't look back when she left, and I didn't expect her to. We'd both known the fight was over the second I dropped that flash drive on the table in Marlin's cafe, and she realized she couldn't talk her way out of the truth. Francine sent me one last text before she blocked me. "You'll regret this when you're old and alone." I read it once and laughed out loud, the sound echoing through the empty house. I didn't bother responding. There was nothing left to say. Lockwood and Stein felt different now, like it had been scrubbed clean of all the tension that had clung to its walls like mildew. I walked through the offices that morning, the smell of fresh coffee and ink mingling with the faint scent of floor wax. I could still picture Dad here, hunched over his drafting table in the corner, sleeves rolled up, sweat beading on his forehead as he sketched out plans for the next big haul. He'd never been afraid to get his hands dirty, and I'd always admired that about him. I found myself standing by the window that overlooked the loading docks, the trucks lined up like soldiers ready for duty. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like a fraud. I felt like his son. I'd kept my promise. I'd protected what he'd built, and I'd made sure that no one who didn't deserve it would lay a finger on it again. I'd upgraded the chair behind his old desk. He'd always said that comfort was the enemy of progress, but I couldn't bring myself to change the mug that sat in the corner, the one he'd used every morning without fail. I traced my finger around its chipped rim, the memory of him so clear it felt like he might walk through the door any second. That mug was a reminder that this wasn't just a business. It was a legacy, and it was mine to protect. I'd left one photo untouched on the wall, Dad and me on the day I graduated from college, his arms slung around my shoulders, pride in his eyes. I stood there for a long time, staring at that photo, letting it fill the space between us that death had tried to steal. I didn't feel vengeful anymore. I didn't need revenge. What I felt was clean, like I'd shed the last layer of something I'd been carrying for too long. It was a quiet kind of justice, the kind that didn't come from punishing people but from removing them entirely. I'd started to understand that sometimes the best way to fight back was to let them walk away, let them show the world who they really were while I focused on what mattered. I thought about the will I'd rewritten, about the shares I'd left for Taryn and Clive, about the way Raymond had smiled when I told him I wanted the people who'd stood by me to know how much they mattered. I thought about Francine's loan application, frozen before it ever had a chance to become a reality, and the way she'd tried to use my father's legacy like a stepping stone. And I thought about Celeste, her eyes wide with disbelief when I told her it was over. All of it felt like a different lifetime now, a chapter closed, the pages sealed. The weeks passed, and the office hummed with the steady rhythm of trucks rolling in and out, drivers chatting over coffee, managers discussing new routes and contracts. The business was healthy, thriving even, and for the first time since my father died, I felt like I wasn't just keeping things afloat. I was moving forward. One Thursday morning, I called a staff meeting. Everyone filed into the conference room, the smell of coffee and donuts filling the air. Clive took his usual seat at the end of the table, his hands folded neatly, his face calm but expectant. Taryn sat beside him, a notepad ready, her eyes bright with that same determination Dad had always loved. I stood at the head of the table, the hum of the overhead lights a quiet soundtrack to the words I'd been rehearsing in my head for days. I know the last few months have been difficult, I began, my voice steady, each word a stone laid on a path I hoped they'd follow. There's been a lot of change, and I know that's unsettling. But I want you all to know that this company is stronger than ever. My father built this place on trust, on hard work, and on loyalty, and that hasn't changed. Clive nodded, his lips pressing into a thin line of approval. We've weathered some storms, I continued, and I'm proud of how each of you has stepped up. You're the reason we're still here, still thriving. And I want you to know that loyalty goes both ways. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small stack of envelopes, each one labeled with a name. I'd worked with Raymond to arrange bonuses, small tokens of gratitude, but also gestures of loyalty, proof that the people who stood by me during the worst of it weren't just employees. They were family. I handed them out one by one, looking each person in the eye as I did. Thank you, I said, over and over, the words sincere, heavy with meaning. When I reached Clive, I paused. He looked up at me, his eyes misty, his hands trembling just slightly as he took the envelope. Your father would be proud, he whispered. I nodded, my own throat tight. I hope so, I managed. After the meeting, the team drifted back to their desks, the mood lighter, the tension that had clouded the office for too long finally lifting. I stayed behind, standing at the window, watching the trucks roll in and out. The sun hit the chrome of their trailers, turning them into streaks of light that reminded me of all the miles my father had driven, all the sacrifices he'd made to build this empire. And I knew then that the legacy wasn't just in the paperwork or the trust funds or the contracts. It was in the people, in the way we showed up for each other, in the way we refused to let the vultures win. That night, I walked the floor of the warehouse, the hum of the machinery a familiar comfort. I checked the locks, the shipping logs, the security cameras, habits that had become second nature. I paused at the break room, the smell of coffee and grease mixing in the air, and thought about the men and women who'd kept this place running through every storm. I owed them more than a paycheck. I owed them the same loyalty my father had given me. I headed back to the office and sat at Dad's desk, the leather chair creaking beneath me. I pulled out the old journal he'd kept, the one with the yellowed pages and faded ink. I flipped through it, reading his notes on route optimizations, on driver safety, on how to negotiate with tough clients. His handwriting was as familiar as my own, each stroke a reminder of the man who'd taught me everything I knew about building something that lasted. On the last page, written in a strong, steady hand, were the words I'd memorized as a boy: protect what you build, stand by the people who stand by you, and never forget who you are. I closed the journal and leaned back, the weight of his words settling over me like a shield. I'd done that. I'd protected what he built. I'd stood by the people who mattered, and I'd cut out the ones who'd tried to tear it down. The next morning, I woke up early, the sky still dark, and brewed a pot of coffee in his old percolator. I poured it into his chipped mug and sat on the porch, watching the sun rise over the hills, the light painting the world in gold and pink. I thought about the past year, the funeral, the betrayals, the fights, the tears. I thought about the man I'd become through it all, harder maybe, but stronger too. And I felt at peace. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for certain. Whatever came my way, I'd face it with my father's strength and my own unbreakable resolve. Because sometimes the deepest justice doesn't come from punishing the people who hurt you. It comes from removing them entirely, from taking their shadows out of your light. And as I sat there, the sun warming my face, I realized that the fight wasn't about winning or losing anymore. It was about living, about stepping forward into the life I'd earned, unburdened, unbroken, and completely free.